Welcome back to Diohan RV. Thank you for joining us on this journey filled with heartbreak, resilience, and hope. Today, a new chapter begins. After everything she's been through, loss, fear, and the warmth of unexpected kindness, Yuhan is ready to go home. But what does home mean when your past is full of unanswered questions? Let's follow her steps as a single mother carves her way through a world that's rarely kind to the gentle-hearted. Yuhan packed her few belongings in silence, careful not to wake Tom. Before leaving, she handed Hong the small sum she had borrowed weeks ago. But Hong shook his head. He looked at the child sleeping in the corner and simply said, "Take care of him. That's all that matters." And in that moment, she realized not all debts are paid with money. Some are repaid through compassion, through love, through letting someone go with your blessing. With every step away from that house, Yuhan felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter from the burdens she no longer had to carry alone. Heavier with the unknown future, and the weight of being everything to her son. But sometimes, walking away is the bravest act of all, especially when it means choosing love over guilt, and hope over fear. This is not an ending. It's the beginning of a woman finding her strength, one step at a time. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Diohan RV. Every comment, every share helps this voice reach someone else who might need it. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of Yuhan's journey. Because sometimes, the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths, and we promise, what comes next will move you deeply. The room was quiet, but Yuhan's heart was not. She looked around, trying to memorize every corner where she had once found peace. Leaving now felt wrong, knowing that Yen was still not out of danger. Her bags were packed, but her thoughts stayed behind. Every instinct in her body told her not to go yet. And perhaps she wouldn't. Not until she knew her friend was truly safe. Something deep inside her resisted goodbye, then stepped into the room quietly. His voice was calm, but his eyes showed worry. He knew what Yuhan was feeling, he felt it too. They both had grown close to Yen, and danger still circled like a shadow. Then sat beside her, speaking gently. "We're all worried about Yen," he said. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." Yuhan nodded, tears held back. In moments like this, friendship felt like the only armor they had, then suggested they meet Mr. and directly. Some things were too important for a phone call. Yuhan agreed. There were decisions to be made, and her heart needed answers. Not only about leaving, but about what they should do next together. Yen's life had changed all of theirs. And now, every choice felt more urgent than ever. They stepped outside, hearts heavy with worry, but also a quiet sense of purpose. Even Murdah, though swamped with responsibilities, had not left Yen's side. He found ways to balance work and watch over her. Yuhan admired that. The world still held people who cared deeply, who didn't turn away when things got hard. Yet the threat was real out there. Someone dangerous still roamed free. That truth weighed heavily on Yuhan. She couldn't leave yet. Not while the person who hurt Yen was still breathing free air. Then arrived at the cafe with a heavy heart. He had seen too much to stay silent, and felt too much to stay still. Across from him, Mr. N's eyes reflected the same storm: fear, guilt, and an urgency that words couldn't ease. They knew evil still lurked nearby, driven by money and capable of anything. If they didn't act now, they might regret it forever. The cafe felt warm, but danger was only a breath away. Then leaned forward, his eyes tense yet determined. He spoke softly, sharing a plan to trap the man responsible. They both knew it was dangerous, but letting fear win meant letting evil continue. Murin nodded slowly, then added his thoughts, his voice edged with worry. They weren't police, but their hearts couldn't turn away. This wasn't just about Yen anymore, it was about standing up for every woman hurt in silence. If they failed, who would be next? They agreed to act soon. Time was not their friend. They shook hands, no smiles, just the silent promise of men who had seen too much pain, as they left the cafe. The weight of their choice followed. The trap was risky, But letting evil run free was worse. 4 yen for Zhu Han. For every innocent life they had to try. Fan and Mr. N arrived at Mr. Chin's house, knowing it wouldn't be easy. Merchin opened the door with a scowl, ready to shut them out. He had every reason to be wary, but then stepped forward, calm but firm. They weren't here to threaten or beg. They came with a deal. A chance to help him out of the pit he was sinking in. Just 5 minutes of his time, that's all they asked for. Merchin didn't answer yet. Murin placed an envelope of cash on the table. This wasn't a payoff, it was a promise. They knew Merchin was drowning in debt, the kind that dragged a man to the edge. Then said softly, "If you help us bring that man here, we'll take care of what you owe. Every last coin." Merchin's eyes darted between the money and their faces. He saw the risk, but he also saw hope for the first time in months. Merchin hesitated. Calling that man meant danger. Shadows he tried to avoid would come knocking again. But the promise of freedom was too tempting. Then added, "We're not just helping you, we're stopping something terrible from happening again." The silence stretched, heavy with decisions. Then Merchin nodded once. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he picked up his phone. The digits weren't unfamiliar. Each beep was a step closer to either salvation or ruin. But it was too late to turn back now. As the phone rang, Merchin closed his eyes. His voice trembled when the man answered. "Come over. We need to talk. It's about money." That was all he said, short, calculated. Murin and Than exchanged a glance. The trap was set, but neither celebrated. There was too much at stake. They knew this wasn't just a plan. It was a turning point. And if they failed, more lives could be lost. Merchin put the phone down. No one said a word. They handed Mr. Chin a small amount of money first, just enough to buy his trust. Every second felt heavy. Outside, Than and Mr. N crouched behind a bush, silently watching, holding their breath. They weren't just waiting, they were preparing. They knew the criminal would arrive soon, hungry for money and willing to kill. The plan was risky, but justice had no place for fear. And tonight, they had decided, was the night this monster would fall. The criminal finally showed up, face wrapped tightly under layers of cloth, eyes scanning the yard like a predator. He wanted the money, fast. But there was none in sight. He growled, his voice thick with threat, as he grabbed Mr. Chin's collar. "You think I'm here to wait?" he snarled. But Mr. Chin, for once in his life, stood his ground. He stalled, stuttered, wiped sweat from his forehead, and bought precious time. Outside, then tightened his grip. As the criminal lost patience, his rage exploded. He shoved Mr. Chin aside and reached into his coat, pulling out a hammer with trembling hands. "Mer," and signaled. Then nodded. In a blink, they split, one from each side. The criminal swung wildly, cornered and feral, but then lunged low, tackling his legs, while Mr. N wrestled the weapon from his grip. It was fierce. Grunts, chaos, blood on their sleeves. For a moment, it seemed over until he twisted free. The moment exploded in chaos. Murin and Than had split up earlier, hiding behind opposite corners of the yard. When the masked man lost patience and lunged toward Mr. Chin, then charged forward, tackling him with full force. The two wrestled violently, dust and rage filling the air. But this wasn't just a fight. For Than, this was protection. For Zhu Han, for Yen, for Tom. Every punch thrown was a scream, no more fear, no more running. Murin joined the fray, locking the attacker's arm, trying to hold him still. But the man fought like a cornered animal, eyes wild with desperation. Than's heart pounded, not from fear but from urgency. They had to stop him now. Not for glory, but for peace. Yet as the seconds ticked, the masked man slipped, sweat, fury, and chaos allowing him to wriggle free. In a blur, he broke from their grip. The thug suddenly kicked Mr. N hard in the stomach and made a run for it. Pain surged through Mr. N's body, but he clenched his jaw and sprinted after him. Every step burned, but he knew what was at stake: Yuhan, Yen, and their fragile safety. He couldn't let that monster disappear again. His breath was sharp, his heart pounding, but his determination cut through everything else like a blade through fog. They crashed into a narrow alleyway, limbs tangled, fists swinging. The criminal roared, clawing to break free, but Mr. and held on with everything he had. In his mind were all the nights Yuhan cried herself to sleep, all the fear in Yin's eyes. He wasn't fighting for revenge. He was fighting for peace, for two women who deserved better than a life spent running from shadows. But just when it seemed Mr. and might win, the thug twisted violently and slammed him into the wall. Mr. and stumbled, gasping, strength fading. That split second could have ended it all until Fan appeared, breathless, eyes blazing. Without a word, he joined the struggle. 2 against 1, the thug thrashed harder. Desperate now, but together, they locked him down, inch by inch. With Fan's added strength, they pinned the thug against the ground. His rage turned to panic, but it was too late. An's face was drenched in sweat and pain, but his eyes burned with quiet triumph. He didn't care about the bruises, the blood, or the torn shirt. What mattered was that Yuhan and Yen could sleep one more night in peace. One more night without fear. Just in time, the police arrived, sirens cutting through the chaos. Fan and Mr. and helped restrain the criminal, guiding him toward the waiting vehicle. The men thrashed once more, but there was nowhere left to run. A strange quiet filled the air. They didn't speak, only nodded. The fight wasn't just physical. It was for everything the women inside that house had suffered through. Justice, for once, had come knocking. As the police drove away with the criminal, Fan and Mr. and turned back toward Mr. Chin's house. There were still things to collect: evidence, the weapon, pieces of truth. But when they arrived, the front gate was ajar. The house was silent, eerily so. Inside, every drawer was empty, every item gone dark. Chin had vanished. Bags packed, doors left open, no sign of return. It was a silence that screamed betrayal. Just as they turned away, a flash of movement caught their eyes. Chin, bag slung over his shoulder, was sprinting down the alley. Fan and Mr. and exchanged a look, then bolted after him without a word. Footsteps echoed between the buildings. He was fast, desperate, and perhaps hiding more than they imagined. Each turn they took narrowed the distance. But what was Mr. Chin really running from? The police, or something darker waiting in his past? Was this the end of his story, or just another beginning? What was hidden in the bag he carried? And if he was desperate enough to flee, what else might he do? The danger hadn't passed yet. If anything, it had only changed its face. And now, more than ever, they had to be ready. Thank you so much for watching today's video on Daiyuhan RV. If this journey moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to unfold: truths buried, fates tangled, and the strength of those who keep moving forward. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a chapter. Because in the next episode, what Mr. Chin is hiding might be far more dangerous than anyone imagined.